This is the third and final part of the review for the Cathy Vickers trilogy, where we'll be, sort of, looking through the last book, Cathy's Ring. If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, where we look through Cathy's book and Cathy's key, you really need to have watched those first for this one to make sense, as it's a direct continuation and conclusion of the review in those videos. And so, a series that began with such promise and potential to be one of the most amazing, innovative, and memorable storytelling experiences I've ever come across, only to end in the most despicable way imaginable, with the creators pissing in the face of their readers and undermining the legitimacy and whole notion of the books they were supposedly creating. So the reason I said we're sort of going to be looking through this book is because I'm not able to show you the physical evidence from the third book, because when I got the book and opened it up, the evidence bag was in there, but it was empty. The seal was still intact and the book was shrink wrapped, so nothing to indicate theft. It just seems to have been a fault on the production end, which is pretty terrible and annoying, but I'm willing to accept that I had the misfortune of being the 1 in 10,000 that had this sort of issue. Mistakes happen and you can always get a replacement. But I went looking online just to make sure this wasn't a widespread issue, which it doesn't appear to be, but in reading reviews I discovered I wasn't really missing much, because all the third book contains in its evidence pouch is a ring and a poster. That's it. Apparently the poster has glow-in-the-dark ink that directs you to more online content, which, as discussed in the last video, is non-existent nowadays anyway, so I couldn't even be bothered requesting a replacement just for that crap. Also, from reading reviews, I learned that apparently looking at the evidence ahead of time spoils the ending as well, which just seems to support my earlier criticism about the thoughtlessness dominating these books and the need for an explicit indication of when to view the evidence. But yeah, I cannot believe that my favorite thing about the first book was how many physical documents there were, and that this immersive approach was the whole point of these books, providing a reading experience that made me enamored with a series I never would have read otherwise, only to, for all real intents and purposes, completely sell out and abandon that for the last book and just have it be a normal novel. If you saw my video on the Guild Trilogy, you'll know my whole reason for showing these types of books is because I want to make a case for it being an incredible yet underused way to present a story in book form. They provide a richer experience than the limited and uninspired and visually boring nature of most novels, and something that can't be replicated in other mediums like audio, video games, movies, etc., that otherwise offer huge appealing advantages that books can't compete with. And because examples of this type of thing are so disappointingly rare, we need to celebrate them because they're not just meaningless gimmicks, only for this series to set that up and then completely undermine it. After reading the first book, despite it not being perfect, I was still positive that even though this isn't the usual sort of story I like, I was getting a storytelling experience that I would still remember long after I'd forgotten about most other novels that I typically read. And instead, I ended up feeling completely betrayed. I was deceived by a high-quality first book to get me hooked. They then noticeably started slacking off in the second, and then for the third book, just putting no effort in, just taking a big dump in the evidence bag and making off with my money now that they're done. The whole approach was just a swindle, and that's why I'm making such a big deal out of this, is because it is objectively and obviously a disgraceful thing they've done for this third book. You know, it's not like when you get to the end of a series and hate the last book because subjectively you don't agree with how the author handled the story or something. That's not what I'm talking about. This is them willfully betraying the reader and the concept that made their book special. There's no way they couldn't know that. They just didn't care. And I just don't understand how people can have such a lack of pride in their work and be that disrespectful to those paying for their work. This idea of abandonment, laziness, and just not giving a crap also extends to the websites, emails, and phone numbers in the third book, as I don't think there was a single one that wasn't already from a previous book. And if I understand correctly, the ones that were created for this book are all just directed from the poster, lazily lumped together rather than spread out with deliberation and impact throughout the story itself. Though this lack of pride in the work is most blatantly evident in the final book, but throughout all 3 books there are enough thoughtless mistakes, inconsistencies, confusion, or just goofs that are too petty and don't ruin the book, so aren't worth mentioning individually, but there are enough that they add up to being a very annoying, unimpressive, and defining feature of these books. I don't think the books were given enough play testing, as it were. Though again, it's sometimes hard to tell if all of these are legitimate criticisms, because it could just be me who's dumb and confused by certain things, but if that's not the case, between all the bungled, confusing, and thoughtless rough edges, the websites being down, the mockery that is the third book, and just the inability to commit to and properly realize the concept, means that now all this is is an example of an amazing idea, spoiled by careless execution. But I still wanted to share them regardless, if only for the first book being an example of a potentially amazing way to create a novel, at least if it were done by people who didn't just slack off and sell out once they got you on board. So I can't comfortably recommend anyone getting involved in these books, either in terms of time, money, or enthusiasm. The only exception would be is if you are someone who likes these sort of YA novels, in which case if you discount all the extra stuff, or at least are okay with everything else I've said, and just want to read these books as a story, then I think that's still an absolutely legitimate way to enjoy these books, because like I said, the books, just in terms of the main text itself, are well written and entertaining reads. And that extends to the third book as well. Just to reiterate, none of my issues with the third book are due to the writing. I still enjoyed that aspect for what it's worth, and despite the knife in my back. Though I will mention that where the first book was very much driven by mystery, the second and third books increasingly move away from mystery and into thriller or even action thriller, as there are fewer questions to be asked and answered. Though at the end of the third book I still definitely was left with a few. I'd also like to reiterate my praise for the illustrations throughout the series, especially since the quality and quantity of the illustrations never waned, and if anything, were even better in the second and third books, which is very surprising. And so that is one aspect that was impressively handled across the trilogy. The only exception to that being a couple of times where there were very obvious inconsistencies with how something is described in the text versus how it appears in the illustrations. Also, as you've seen for yourself, it's not like amazing art that you're going to get framed or pore over. I'm talking impressive in terms of the frequency, style, and just what they contribute to the experience, and making every page visually interesting compared to the visual nothingness that are the pages of your typical novel. Lastly, I'll mention the different editions of the books just in case you are still interested regardless. So the books were initially published by Running Press in the US, and the front covers featured Cathy's phone number. For the UK editions published by Bloomsbury that we've been looking at in these videos, that phone number was changed to an email address. They were also eventually released in paperback, and I've never seen those, so I'm not sure what the differences are. Specifically, I'm wondering if they even actually include any physical documents, because according to some of the reviews I was reading, it seems like maybe some or all of those pieces were instead included as photos in a color section in the center of the books. Another difference is that originally there was a product placement deal with CoverGirl to have their makeup referenced in the book. It's not like it was obnoxiously or distractingly done. I barely even noticed, if at all, though it doesn't exactly assuage my impression that the authors are hustlers and sellouts. But apparently it caused some sort of stir for whatever reason, and so those references to CoverGirl's products were dropped from the paperback versions. There's also audiobook versions, though obviously so much of the experience can't be translated to audio, and instead of a standard ebook, they released a special app version of the first book at least. I'm not sure if they did so for the other two, but that actually looked pretty well done from the video demo I saw, though as far as I can tell it's no longer available anyway. Maybe they pulled it since all the website links no longer work, which I guess is just further proof as to why I think for these sort of experiences, it's still physical books that are ultimately the best, at least if they're created by people who actually give a crap about producing the best work possible and not just half-arsing a gimmick.